Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the Robert Heilbroner lecture honoring our colleague Robert Heilbroner, who passed away in 2006, but has lived on and has lived on for many economists and economists-to-be, because his book, The Worldly Philosophers, that now co-written with Will Milberg, is still read across the country and across the world. And the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis, of which I'm the director, Teresa Ghilarducci, and also chair of the economics department this year, is pleased to sponsor an annual lecture in his honor to an economist that lives up to, why am I doing this? That lives up to not only in his spirit of broadening horizons of economics, of public intellectualism, but of actually a very good writer. That we've tried to get people who engage in economics in a very literary form. Paul Krugman and now Deirdre McCloskey is our speaker today. Paul Krugman has been our speaker in the past. Nancy Fulbray last year. So I would like to introduce Deirdre's colleague and my colleague, Will Milberg, to introduce our speaker tonight. And I want to welcome you personally to the lecture series. Thank you.
So, very briefly, because we're all waiting for the main event, it's a great pleasure to introduce Deirdre McCloskey. I mean, who else would have the chutzpah to come to a Marxist pinko department and lecture on the treasured bourgeoisie? Actually, it's not as implausible as it sounds. Deirdre McCloskey is educated with a PhD at Harvard, taught at Chicago, Iowa, now University of Illinois, Chicago, where she holds actually positions in 4 different departments. If I try to read off the list, I'll be like Rick Perry, and I'll forget a couple of them. I'm not trying to eliminate any of those departments. Deirdre McCloskey is really one of the few worldly philosophers in the profession today, and her intellectual career spans 3 phases. She was an economic historian of the Industrial Revolution, very capable with data, econometrics, on issues of money, balance of payments, industrial development, articles in the leading journals in the profession, president of the Economic History Association. She was a renegade who revolted against the pseudoscience of economics in the late 20th century, insisting that economics, even in its most mathematical or statistical renditions, is rhetorical. It's a device for persuasion, and it's no closer to objective truth than any other rhetorical form. In her 3rd phase, she is renewed as an economic historian whose reading of history, fortunately, is very influenced by the 2nd phase on the rhetoric of economics. She's bolder, I would say, more erudite, and yes, more persuasive. The 3 phases have been very productive, not just in terms of articles in leading journals, but in terms of books. And the list of books is long, and they are each one really very fascinating. The Rhetoric of Economics really launched the 2nd phase, which was followed by 3 other books about the rhetoric and the uproar that it caused. If You're So Smart, Narrative of Economic Expertise, Knowledge and Persuasion in Economics, and most recently, The Cult of Statistical Significance. The 3rd phase that we're going to hear about tonight is in its 2nd book. So these have been highly productive phases. The first was called Bourgeois Virtues, and the 2nd one, in a trilogy to be completed, is Bourgeois Dignity, Why Economics Can't Explain the World. So we have the good fortune to catch Deirdre McCloskey tonight in the 3rd phase. And it's in that phase in which I think the worldly philosopher of McCloskey is most evident. In the final edition of The Worldly Philosophers, which I did not co-author with Bob, Bob added a seventh chapter, and or 11th chapter, I'm sorry, it's called the End of the Worldly Philosophy, and it has a question mark at the end, and that chapter was added in the 7th edition, and it plays off on the two meanings of the word end, both purpose and termination. And so there's ambiguity in the word end, and there's ambiguity with the question mark at the end of the title of that chapter. And Bob was a great believer in nuance and the importance of ambiguity. He once remarked to me that his book, Marxism, For and Against, the most contentious word in that title was the word and. But in this 11th chapter, in which he plays on this dual meaning of the word and, termination of the worldly philosophy, is it over? And what is the purpose of the worldly philosopher? He really previsaged many of the themes that Deirdre has come to in this last phase, these last two books, and particularly the one we're going to hear about tonight. Economics, and I'll run through just a short list of them. Economics is an explanation system of capitalism. We can't sever economics from ethical considerations that it necessarily implies. While economics needs mathematics, its growing scientism comes at the expense of explaining capitalism. Human volition and politics make economic systems different from systems of electrons. So he writes, and I'm reading here, in economics, there are no such givens comparable to those of nature. Moreover, to admit to the presence of power and obedience in the arrangements of all stratified societies does not thereby allow us to attribute to our explanation the objectivity we seek in our clarification of nature. It only applies the language by which we describe nature's workings to those of society. If such a pseudo-scientific view were to become the aim of economics, it would indeed spell its termination as a worldly philosophy. Then he speaks at the end of this chapter of the second meaning, the end or the purpose. And he writes, a worldly philosophy has a unique potential to provide the visionary guidance that will help at least some capitalisms make their way as safely as possible through the coming decades. In this time of foreseeable stress, the purposeful end of the worldly philosophy should be to develop a new awareness of the need for and the possibilities of socially as well as economically successful capitalisms. So please join me in welcoming Deirdre McCloskey as the Robert Heilbroner Lecturer for 2012.
Thank you very much. The other thing you need to know about me, by way of introduction, is that I have a speech defect, and that this is a free country. Hi, Dick. This is a free country, and so if you can't stand it, you can run screaming from the room. It's all right. I won't break down crying or anything. I'm honored, of course, to be speaking in the name of Bob Heilbroner. I'm one of those numerous people who got into economics because between my freshman year and my sophomore year, I read the worldly philosophers. It would be an interesting empirical inquiry to count how many there are. It wouldn't be that hard. You just do a random sample and do a survey. But it'll be a very large number. Bob Heilbroner and I came to not have similar pre-analytic visions, as he would say. I'm a Chicago school economist. Maybe it'll be the only one you'll ever know. Milton Friedman was a personal friend of mine. But what Bob had was grace, I think is the best word for it. I tend to judge people, and you can see why, by how they reacted to my gender change. And I saw Bob shortly after it in a restaurant in New York, and I said to my friend I was with, I've got to, there's Bob Heilbroner, I got to go say hi to him. So I went over to say hi, and without a ripple, he introduced me as Deirdre to his wife, and said she's a very distinguished economist, which coming from Heilbroner is very high praise. What I don't, in a way, as Will perhaps suggested, I've become more like Heilbroner as I've gotten older. And maybe he got a little bit more enthusiastic about capitalism. In any case, the theme and purpose of the three books called the Bourgeois Era that I'm working on is a apology for capitalism. Now, I'm not sorry that capitalism happened. I told you I was a Chicago school economist. So it's apology in the Greek sense, a defense of the way we innovate with market tests and have to an extraordinary degree in the last couple of centuries. The third book is not out yet. It's not finished. I hope to finish it by Christmas. But speaking of Christmas, these make excellent Christmas gifts. Absolutely. Buy them in bulk. I'm an American. I believe in commercial free speech. These buy them in bulk. Solve your birthday gift, Hanukkah, Chinese New Year, whatever you want. The first question I asked is, can you be an active participant in what we call a capitalist economy and have an ethical life? Or is the modern world corrupting? Now, I think the correct answer is yes and no. Of course, the modern world is corrupting. Every world is corrupting. Every socioeconomic system has the potential for encouraging evil. I'm an Anglican. I'm a progressive Episcopalian, the Quaker branch of the frozen chosen, as we say. And I believe in original sin, in the sense that I believe that you can be bad under socialism and bad under capitalism and bad under this kind of capitalism and that kind of socialism. Bad, bad, bad. Oh my God, isn't it awful? But I argue in the book that there's an ethical capitalism available. In fact, I have some pages here in which I specifically criticize Heilbroner for his views on the so-called robber barons in the late 19th century in the United States. So the claim is that a so-called virtue ethical way of looking at how to be a good person, or indeed how to be a bad person if you add a minus sign, is the correct way to think about the potential for good and bad, for flourishing ethical life or a corrupt one in a market economy. The second book, Bourgeois Dignity, Why Economics Can't Explain the Modern World, is an inquiry, a kind of ground clearing operation for volume 3, which I'm going to speak of. And it asks, is the way that economists on the left and the right and the middle talk about how we came to the modern world plausible? And I conclude that it's not. Whether you're a Marxist or a bourgeois economist, you can't explain the most extraordinary feature of the modern world, which is that here we are. I look around. I see no descendants of the crowned heads of Europe, Asia, Africa. Let's see, is there anyone here? I don't see any Habsburg chins. I take it that everyone in this room is the descendant of an unspeakably poor peasant or hunter-gatherer, if you go back far enough. I think that's fair enough. I don't mean to insult you. I apply it to myself. My ancestors on my father's side were recently Irish-American lumberjacks in Wisconsin. They're the ones who cut down all the trees. On my mother's side, you have to go a little further back before you run into appalling poverty, $3 a day poverty. Imagine trying to live in Manhattan on $3 a day. You thought that your graduate school stipend was low. Try $3 a day for everything. You can buy in New York half a cappuccino for that, and that's it. So this extreme poverty that characterized the ancestors of everyone in this world is evidently, wouldn't you say, changed. We're much better off than our ancestors were. And that is, I would say, the most important secular event in human history, comparable to the invention of full language about 100,000 years ago, or the discovery, the domestication of plants and animals in various different parts of the world starting about 10,000 years ago. And it only started 2 centuries ago. And it's what we mean when we say modern capitalism. Or at least it's what I mean. I'm the boss here. I get to say what I mean by modern capitalism. And I mean the system of market-tested innovation that has characterized first Northwestern Europe and then other parts of the world, such as New England or Belgium. Finally, thank God, India. For a long time in the 1980s, I was very unhappy because the world's largest tyranny, namely China, was doing very well, and the world's largest democracy was doing very badly. And I'm so glad that that's no longer so. So, one way of understanding someone's position, and I'd like to spend a lot of the time we have together and back and forth. So I'll try to be brief, but you've heard professors say that before. One way of understanding someone's scientific position is to know who they agree with and who they disagree with. I don't regard the people I disagree with as my enemies. Some of them are here in the room. I've known people like this for a long time. But they're not my enemies. They're my opponents. If you've ever examined someone for the PhD degree in Sweden, they have this marvelous, terrifying institution of being an opponent, which means you have to summarize the candidate's dissertation, then you have to engage in a colloquy with the candidate for half an hour with the candidate's mother and father sitting there. It's very distressing. But that's how I view my colleagues who I disagree with. Now, let me remind myself of who it is I disagree with. I disagree with Bob Heilbroner on the whole. Let's speak of the people on the left. Emmanuel with Wallerstein, Fernand Braudel. I agree with Gramsci. This is, again, you may know on the left. Gramsci and the rethinking Marxism crowd. In the middle, I disagree with Samuelson and Keynes and Weber, the late John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. I agree with early Mill. On the right, I disagree with Douglas North and my friend and opponent David Landis, and I agree with early Schumpeter and, above all, Adam Smith. How to summarize the basic theme of 3 big books? Be happy. At one point, I wanted to do 6 of these books. I mean, this is insane. This is quis insania, as the poet said. This is madness. So I decided this fall to cut it off at 3. And if I have anything more to say on these matters, I'll come back with some other series. How to summarize it? I think the way most useful to this audience is to say the following. Capitalism, modern economic growth, the enrichment that made us in this room able to gather at the new school and discuss philosophy and history and economics, has nothing to do, that's much too strong, is not caused by capital accumulation. Now, this is heresy among Marxists, it's heresy among Samuelsonian economists. By the way, we should stop calling them mainstream economists. That's to make us the backwater. So I want you to start calling them Samuelsonian economists. Because the way of being an economist in the United States was mainly invented by Paul Anthony Samuelson. Incidentally, my mother's mixed doubles tennis partner, in case you care. But Paul Anthony Samuelson and his brother-in-law, Kenneth Arrow, their mutual nephew is Lawrence Summers. You know, imagine Hanukkah at that place. 4 economists, mothers, fathers, uncles, aunts. They invented Samuelsonian economics. And in both of these, both in Marxism and in Samuelsonian economics, what's supposed to make us rich is the accumulation of capital. Now, this isn't a crazy idea. I mean, my rich friends have bigger houses than I have, although I've got a pretty big house. And their car is much bigger. I have a smart car. a yellow convertible with a racing stripe. So, and it seems obvious. How do you get rich? Well, you get more houses. Say 7, which the number you can't remember where they are. Or if you're a poor country, you look around at a poor country and it looks like the railways are in terrible shape, and the airports are kind of crummy, and the housing is bad, and well, let's put some capital in those people, and that'll make them better off. It's been the assumption of foreign aid since the war, essentially. It's what Bill Easterly calls capital fundamentalism. And Bill and I agree that capital fundamentalism is wrong. That what explains the modern world, I say, I'll detach myself from Easterly, he can make his own speech. What I say caused the modern world is technology, improved ways of doing things. Making this wonderful rug you've got here, this marvelous carpet that comes in, look at how wide it is. There's the seam right there, and there's not another seam until the wall. And you can't do that by hand. If you were to try to do it, I suppose you could do it by hand, but it would take you 10 years. And I would hope you to get out of this somewhat monotonous pattern in the course of 10 years. But anyway, there it is. Cheap carpeting. Very cheap carpeting. I'm sorry, I don't mean to. My university has cheaper carpeting, I believe you. Mine is a state university in Chicago. Reinforced concrete, I suppose actually that's probably iron. I don't know what that is, but reinforced concrete, which combines a Roman technology of concrete, of cement, with cheap steel, which had just been invented in the middle of the 19th century because Henry Bessemer thought it would be neat. It's kind of a boyish thing to blow air through boiling pig iron to see what would happen. Kind of see that guys would kind of like this. Boom! And all the carbon left the iron. Then you added some carbon back in and got steel. Electric lights. Here we are. Has it ever occurred to you that we're back in the caves? These places that we live are caves, aren't they? Except they're caves with very good lighting. It's heated. It's heated automatically. These chairs, these marvelous chairs, are made of, I guess that's wood. But that's actually plywood. I can see that it is. Plywood itself is a significant modern invention. It's very, very strong. It's made of peeled strips of wood and glue, and it's exceptionally strong for its thickness, and on and on and on. In other words, now of course you had to have capital to embody these improvements. You have to have wires to make the electricity go. You have to have ships to move the corn, the hybrid corn, which is another kind of invention. But my claim is that the capital investment is anterior to the discoveries. That it's technology that's the driver. It's not C to M to C, or M to C to M. M star, M asterisk, M prime, M prime. It's not capital accumulation in a solo type neoclassical model. That's not what caused the modern world. Now, How do I know? Well, in the first place, it's always been so that there was capital accumulation. I can give you many examples of this, and you're urged to buy these marvelous books to be further persuaded. For example, in European agriculture, which depended on grains like oats and wheat and barley, yields in pre-modern times were extremely low. 3 output from 1 seed. 3 or 4. So that this is unlike rice, which has, even in its earlier forms, had much higher yield seed ratios. But in Europe, 1/3 of the grain crop, or 1/4 or 1/5, had to be thrown, pardon me, had to be thrown on the ground. You know, that old painting of the sower. Imagine how it felt when you have hunger pains and you're taking grain that you could eat and you're going along casting it all day into the furrows and hoping it will grow next year. So that's an extreme form of saving, abstention from consumption. Of course, if you don't, you starve the next year. But that's the character of investment. If you don't invest, you don't get a return. The ability of earlier societies to invest was very high. This is against Walt Rostow, who said that the takeoff to self-sustained growth was caused by a rise in the savings rate. Well, we economic historians, we have some here, can attest that savings rates in Britain in particular were not particularly high in the 18th century. And indeed, there were other societies who at the same stage of industrialization had much higher savings rates. And the savings rate in Britain didn't go up very much in the 18th century. Indeed, it was an old discovery before we Cleometricians got to the task of English economic historians that the capital requirements of early factories were very small. It was indeed, as my former colleague Eric Hobsbawm says, it was in the age of capital that we needed big masses of capital. To put it another way, the railway age. The capital output, or the output capital ratio in railways is about 10. You need 10 to produce 1, whereas in most industries, most parts of the economy, it's much smaller. And in particular, in the dark satanic mills, which by the way is not what the poem means, but let's go with it. In the dark satanic mills, the financing was achieved from wholesalers, from suppliers, from whoever could offer commercial credit and roll it over. So you didn't need vast amounts of capital to have industrialization in that sense. And much earlier societies were very capable of capital accumulation. I just spent 2 very interesting days in Guatemala in the sites. One of them is called Tikal, in the company of an archaeologist who could actually read the script. So she'd be walking along and she says, oh, look, that says blah, 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 blah. It's amazing. This is a script that's been only recently decoded. And that was capital accumulation, building pyramids, building the, what is it called, the temple of the sun and the moon at Teotihuacan in Mexico, the pyramids that we normally think of, the Great Wall of China, the Grand Canal, longer than any other canal in the world. The French were extremely proud of their canal, which allowed them to link the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, which they finished in the late 17th century. Its total length was about 170 miles. The Grand Canal was 1,000 miles long and had been finished with blocks hundreds of years before. So capital accumulation was not the constraint. It was not the surplus value plowed back into the enterprise that caused the modern world. Furthermore, the kind of world we have, where there's lots of innovation. Now let's not talk about innovation yet. Where there are markets in which the innovations are tested. You decide to open a convenience store over here because you think it'll make money. It's tested in the marketplace. If it turns out that people don't want a convenience store there, you go out of business, and that takes care of that. On the other hand, you think of a convenience store somewhere else, and it turns out to be a great success. That's innovation tested by markets. I mean, there are other ways of testing innovations. We could have boards of wise people deciding whether this innovation was good or bad, or we could have a vote, just a vote. Is it a good idea? The citizens of New York could vote. That's another way of doing it. But this market testedness is modern, but it's also ancient. There have been markets forever. There were markets in obsidian in Central America. They find pieces of this volcanic glass hundreds and hundreds of miles from its origin in central Mexico. And indeed, as it gets further away, it gets thinner. That is the pieces we find. Just exactly as you'd expect from ordinary Smithsonian economics or Chicago School economics. When something gets more expensive, you're more cautious in using it. There have been markets since there were speaking humans. Now, people are liable to say, well, but they weren't central. Well, they were pretty central. In the European Middle Ages, to speak of something I know something about, everything was for sale. Grain was for sale. Iron was for sale. Shipping services were for sale. Labor was for sale. Half of the population in the countryside in southern England in the 13th century worked for daily wages. They also were serfs at the same time, but half of them supplemented their plot of land by working on some other serfs' land or on the Lord's land for pay. 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, we find labor contracts on clay. Land was for sale. Husbands were for sale. Marketplaces were for sale. Eternal salvation was for sale. Now think about that. Wouldn't you like to buy some eternal salvation? Afterwards, I'll be out there. I'm selling it. You have to convert to Episcopalianism. That's the trick. Okay. Nor was the state entirely predatory. This is the view that Douglas North has shall we say, perpetrated. It's the view that what made the modern world is that once the king stole everything from everyone, and so it was stupid to invest. As Hobbes said, the life of man was therefore solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Then we developed property rights. Doug on the right is very enthusiastic for property rights. And so we got rich. Simple as that. Here's an ancillary argument he makes, equally incorrect historically, is that patents are the key to modern economic growth. Make ideas into property. Doug likes property, so do I, but he likes it more than I do. And he says, make ideas into property. And then, of course, innovation itself will become an economic activity, and you're off to the races. Now, the trouble with this is that property rights were pretty good in the Middle Ages. They were excellent in China. They were first rate in the Ottoman Empire. It's not the case that previous societies were the war of all against all. This is a fellow named Acemoglu and Robinson have made a big stir with this argument. And it's historically wrong. It's mistaken. Not to. So, not capital accumulation, because it's routine. That's the historical argument. But there's an economic argument. There is an argument that you don't have to know anything about history to accept. And that is, as Keynes said, the marginal product of capital, don't bother me about that. Let's just suppose there is such a thing. The marginal product of capital would be driven down to zero in a generation if there was no innovation, as Keynes indeed thought was the case in the 1930s. Turns out, as Alex Field has argued, that the 1930s was the most technologically innovative decade in American history, 1930s. That is, capital accumulation by itself doesn't make us very rich. Piling brick on brick, which was the old physical capital way of looking at it, or piling BA on BA, which is the new, it's kind of new, human capital, or piling knowledge on knowledge is not the way economies grow. Now, how do I know all this? Let me say it again. Here's the main fact that you need to know. And if I do nothing else this afternoon, if I can persuade you to take this one fact seriously, the quality of your thinking about the economy and economic history will be very greatly increased. So this is really cheap. This is going to be painless, it's very short, and it's crucial. If you know it, you're in great shape. Here's how it goes. Suppose we start at $3 a day around the invention of full language, say 100,000 BCE. And since I don't want to reach down to the floor, I'll make 0 here, right here. And $3 a day is here. Now my finger has a remarkable property, which is that I can draw empirical scientific diagrams with the finger, and it just does it without error. No error, no sampling error, nothing like that. So it goes along like this, and you know, it's 100,000 years ago, so that's quite a long time ago. And around 8,000 BCE in the ancient Near East, and then shortly thereafter in many other independent places in the world, New Guinea, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, Peru, East Asia, they invent agriculture. And so now watch, you have to see this, or I'll do it twice for the people behind the post. It goes up a bit, but then it goes down on Malthusian grounds, because people get a little richer above $3 a day. Their children survive childhood, which is a good thing to do, and the women are more fertile, And the population goes up, and diminishing returns sets in. And the real wage or the real income goes back down to $3. So agriculture doesn't make people better off. It makes for more of them. It makes for urban life, from which we get etymologically civilization. So I'm not against agriculture. As I said, all of us were once agriculturalists. That's fine, but it doesn't make us rich. Now we come to 200 years ago. Let me stop it earlier so that more people behind the post can see it. Suppose this is the present. 100,000 years ago, here we are, 200 years ago. Now you have to watch this very closely or you're not going to get the point. This is a serious scientific diagram. I want you, no one laughing. No laughing aloud. It goes like this. That's very important. The sound effects are very important to the matter. It goes up by a factor of, in the world as a whole, a factor of 10 per capita. This includes the worst cases of poverty that we still have in the world, a factor of 10. 10 times goes from $3 a day to $30 a day worldwide. Places like the United States or Japan goes from $3 a day to $100 a day, thereabouts. In the United States, it's $125 a day. In the Norway of my cousins, it's $147 a day, which really annoys the Swedes. So, and that's a conservative estimate. That's an estimate that doesn't account adequately for improved quality of goods. Bill Nordhaus is the pioneer in this. And not only do we have more lighting, but it's better. Not only do we have more medicine, but it's better. He and I were trading old people's talk. We always talk about our maladies and about how wonderful hip operations are and artificial knees. Now don't laugh, you'll all get there. Or I hope you do. I hope you do. Don't laugh. Economics has improved. Take economics. The economics of 1800, well, it had the blessed Adam Smith, and that's a long way, but it wasn't up to modern standards. So quality improved. So it's more than a factor of 30 or 33. Now, you can see how hard it's going to be to explain it with capital accumulation. Because if it explains it, why didn't it happen earlier? And if it needs technological change for the capital to be worth accumulating, then Marx, by the way, I regard Marx as the greatest social scientist of the 19th century. That makes all my conservative friends very angry. But then I balance it by saying, and he was wrong about almost everything. So he was the greatest social scientist, but mistaken. And he said famously, accumulation, accumulation, this is Moses and the prophets. No, Carl, it's not. It's innovate, innovate. That's Moses and the prophets and Jesus Christ. And Mohammed and whoever else you want to add in. So why then the innovation? Well, my claim in volume 2, reinforced in volume 3, this wonderful volume 3, put your orders in early to the University of Chicago Press, is that it was, now hear this, liberty and dignity for ordinary people. Now, the middle class, the bourgeoisie, is, from the point of view of the aristocracy, very much ordinary people. And liberty to try out stuff and social esteem to keep you at work is what made for innovation, for this frenetic innovation, this astounding increase in the rate of innovation. Up until, 1700, by far the most innovative economy in the world is China. We don't call it China. We don't call porcelain China for just because we're crazy. We call it that way because for 1,500 years, China had a virtual monopoly on making thin-walled porcelain, or what we call porcelain. It's only in the early 18th century that the Germans, the French, and the English, more or less at the same time, in slightly different ways, each of them, reverse-engineered porcelain. The Chinese had invented everything. They invented the blast furnace. It's conventional to say they invented the compass and paper. But, you know, let's go further. They were using paper for clothing in the 2nd century. Made it easier to cheat on exams, you know. Paper. They were fantastically innovative. But the pace of innovation in the 18th, and especially the 19th, and most particularly the 20th century, starting in northwestern Europe and spreading, was amazing. It was much faster. It was loony. It was insane. Every year in the United States, somewhere, one of 10,000 new grocery store products is being tried out. Every year. I mean, this is wacko. Maybe it's wasteful, could be. But it's innovation. And the ones that, I had a friend in advertising who had the unfortunate job of advertising Pringles' newfangled potato chips when they first came out. Those of you old enough to know that they tasted like cardboard. They were terrible. They were in a nice can. You could use the can to put your pencils in or something, or you store your spaghetti. But the potato chips were terrible. And he had to sell them. The old saying is, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And he wasn't able to make them drink. So there's this amazing innovation caused by what amounts to an ideological change, a change in ideas, a change in the valuation of innovation itself. It's not surprising that art, music, cuisine is innovative in the 18th and 19th century in Europe, and it's not surprising that world music and world cuisine is fantastically innovative now. So, let me give you one concluding example. Now, I assure you, well, we could lock the doors and keep you here for the next couple of days, have food brought in. I understand New York has excellent pizza. And I could give you all the evidence. All the evidence. I could read my books and read the manuscript of the 3rd volume, but I won't. I'll just give you one example. The example is the word honest in English. It's important that it's in English. Honest now means what we think it means. It means you tell the truth, you keep your promises. An honest person who is someone who is open in a commercial context, even. He's honest. If you think it's surprising, he's an honest merchant. Honest. You think, well, what's the big deal? In Shakespeare's time, the word honest didn't mean what it means now. If you go to a go to a dictionary of Shakespeare in English, or indeed to the plays themselves, the Othello, the Moor of Venice, is the one that uses the word honest in the most prominent way. You'll find that what it means is honorable. Honorable in an aristocratic sense. Skilled at the court. Successful on the battlefield. Honorable. And this is true of every commercial language in Europe. It's true in Italian. Same thing happens. Onesto is defined in compendious Italian dictionaries now as aristocratico obsolete, right? The same is true in French. And then, remarkably, the same is true in Germanic languages with a completely different root. The root for the word honest in English and French is, surprisingly, honestus, which means in classical Latin, aristocratically honorable. It does not mean you tell the truth. That word was sincerus, sincere, and was not highly valued in an aristocratic society. But remarkably, in Germanic languages, where the root term for honor is er, as in Dutch, er means honorable. In German, when you answer the phone, if you're an old-fashioned sort of person, you say, "To whom do I have the honor, the er, to speak?" But in those languages too, this is true in Swedish as well, and in those languages too, the same transformation takes place. Over the very centuries in which the bourgeoisie is being revalued. The word honest, once used for the court, comes to be used for commerce. And eerlijk, now in Dutch, is the ordinary word for honesty. Honesty of the sort that we can understand. So, Volume 3 is mainly about this change, about the, it's called The Treasured Bourgeoisie, and it's got a really long subtitle. If I can think of some way of shortening it, I'd like to, and if you have suggestions. Let's see. How innovation became virtuous, 1600 to 1848, and then dubious. Is that the word I use? I think so. That is, after 1848, after the failed bourgeois and proletarian revolutions in Europe of 1848, the intelligentsia turned against capitalism in a pronounced way. And out of that came socialism. All right, so my tale is that markets and innovation are a good thing, that they're good for ordinary people. I said you can define people by who their opponents are, and I'll read you something from Emanuel Wallerstein, who I was reading this morning. He said, "The balance sheet of historical capitalism, to which I shall return, is perhaps complex, but the initial calculus in terms of material distribution of goods and allocation of energies is, in my view, very negative indeed." Now, this was written in 1983, and Emanuel Wallerstein's not an economist. And in 1983, it was still possible for someone who's not paying attention to economics to make such a claim, that the proletariat has been impoverished by capitalism, that the world proletariat has been impoverished by capitalism, if not the proletariat in England. But it ain't so. By 2012, we can say that that's not so. As I say here, nor is there a spiritual case against capitalism. You can have a full and flourishing and dignified human life and still be part of this innovative market society. I would like to find another word than capitalism. Capitalism, the word capitalism has given us a tremendous amount of trouble. Wallerstein says, I hear this, you know, he's a very, I admire him very much. He's a fine scholar. I'm not making fun of him. But I think he shouldn't have said this. He said, whoops, wait a second, that's the wrong page. He said, what did he say? He said the word capitalism is derived from capital. It would be legitimate, therefore, to presume that capital is a key element in capitalism. What? Suppose I did it this way. The word astrology is derived from the Latin word for star. It would be legitimate, therefore, to presume that stars are a key element in human affairs. It's an empirical question. And I'm saying that the facts and the logic show that capitalism has not depended on capital. It's depended on ideas, ideology, creativity, and the liberty and dignity of ordinary folk. Thank you very much. Now we're going to have a change for the discussion so it gets recorded for posterity. I'm going to hand this around, whoever wants. Oh, yes. I'm going to go over that mic. Okay.
If I had the very great misfortune to be appointed your opponent, I think I would argue something like the following. Isn't it really what Marx called social relations that are at the core of the transformation of society and the transformation of our material life?
Yeah.
And in particular, just to make sure I'm not being misunderstood,
Yeah.
this is not, in my view, a question of people becoming more economically rational, more acquisitive.
Although, as you know, that's a common version of it.
Well, but that's not the one that I'm, as
I
your
understand.
opponent, I'm adopting. In fact, I would adopt the point of view that the social relations have transformed people to be more other-regarding, more honest in the modern sense of the word.
I think
That
that's
is,
right.
More willing to stand by their relations with other people.
Yeah.
And it's that change in our social being and in our social intercourse that may even underlie the innovation and market-tested
I
innovation
think
that you.
that's very plausible. In fact, in the first book, I talk about the very interesting history of friendship, the concept of friendship in Europe. And in Italian manuals of the 14th and 15th century for young merchants, the advice is don't trust anyone. And what is very clear, and I can think of just right off the bat, I can think of lots of concrete examples of it. What happens is improved trust. A merchant in Glasgow buys tobacco in Virginia, and actually, remarkably, expects to get paid, or he expects to pay, and the plantation owner in Virginia expects to get. It's amazing, and it's a new trust. Now, I'd worry a little bit about it, but it's worth thinking about. Trust in Islam was great. Trust in Judaism was great. Trust indeed in ethnic and religious minorities has always been great, because the punishment is you get thrown out of it. So I wonder, but no, I'm very open to these sociological hypotheses. I spent the first half of my career saying that sociologists are stupid and I hate them. And my Anglican God has condemned me to spend the second half saying sociologists are great and they got all these wonderful ideas. So 1 minus 1 equals 0, I suppose. There's someone behind you after him. Let's go to him first, but then you.
Yeah, speaking of the new school,
Yeah, please.
I think there was a fellow named Veblen who was here.
There
who
was.
talked about the leisure class. And,
Yeah, my father's hero.
yeah. And so he was talking about technology being the thing that can move society forward.
Yes, he was.
And the fact that people were instead involved with conspicuous consumption.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
are you a Veblenite?
Well, I'm more a Veblenite than I was for a long time. When I was a kid, I was a Veblenite, and then I said, "Oh no, I want to be a Chicago school economist," so I stopped being a Veblenite. Now I'm more of a Veblenite in the sense that I believe that the economy, as the sociologists say, is embedded in a society. That it's not good economics to assume that for many purposes that we can just kind of omit what I call the S variables of sociology and speech and the sacred. So to that extent, I agree with Veblen, but the trouble is that he was obsessed with the engineers, with technology. And there has to be a market test of the technology, or it's not obvious that it's an advance. There has to be some test, and we have to have some, scale of what we mean by advance. And one reasonable one is, are people willing to pay for it? But he hated financial capital. He hated the managers. He wanted the engineers to run the economy. And that engineering view is what you see in Soviet central planning, for example. And it wasn't such a good idea. There's got to be a market test. Around behind the pillar, there's someone.
Yes, I had a question.
Please.
So, if I understand you correctly, you seem to be arguing that roughly 300 years ago, that there's a change, particularly in Western society, and it's not about an accelerating pace of capital accumulation,
No.
but rather more felicitous conditions for innovation,
Yes.
and an accelerated pace of innovation.
Yes, it is.
But around the same time, with Duncan's comments, we're sort of signaling towards a sociological component in a
Yeah.
way in which people relate to one another and
Yeah.
imagine relationships with people across great distances, particularly in the commercial realm, as
Yeah.
being conducive to these innovative breakthroughs and this accelerated pace of innovation. But I'm listening to you talk, and I'm thinking about a terrible innovation
What was
that
that?
took place at the same moment in time, which is the invention and codification of racialized chattel slavery, which sort of, I think, underlies all of the inventions and innovations of that period, both
Yeah.
in terms of organizing labor relations, in terms of
think
processing
so.
commodities, in terms of organizing the commodity markets
Yeah.
to supply these plant. I mean, you mentioned
Yeah.
the Virginia planter
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of wondering, and that is an innovation. It's an innovation of social relationships, but it's not. It's quite
Look,
in contrary in terms of honoring other human beings.
I completely agree, but that's all wrong. Almost all of what you say is wrong. Although I agree that Don't get me wrong. Slavery is bad, but it was not until bourgeois people in England in the late 18th century started to say so, Quakers in particular, that people objected to slavery as a system. And it's not true that it was invented in the say the early 17th century or the 16th century. On the contrary, the trans-Saharan slave trade was centuries old at that time. There were as many slaves in the whole history of slavery in sub-Saharan Africa,
But
the export of slaves.
It's not racialized chattel slavery.
Tell that to the blacks sent to Istanbul. I don't know that that's true. I agree with you that there's a theory of race that develops, but that happens late. That's 19th century. That it's racialized in the new world, as you know, it's racialized in various different ways, is about the difficulties of enslaving Native Americans, and about who you could successfully enslave
Exactly.
in tropical and subtropical areas in the New World. Slavery from, the word slave comes, as you know, from the word Slav. And the reason it comes from the word Slav is that after the Mongol invasion, the Golden Horde was exporting massive numbers of Slavs into Constantinople to be sold. So slavery, racialized or not, is not unusual to the modern world. And this isn't to say that every innovation is a good thing. I agree that transatlantic slavery was a terrible idea. Eugenics was which is a connected scientific idea, was also a terrible idea, and was science. In 1910, most good scientists believed in race, believed in eugenics, and there you were. Slavery was a very small part of European capitalism. That's just in the numbers. And if you think about it, it more or less has to be so. Because what were these slaves making? Well, in the 17th and 18th century, they were making sugar, some coffee.
Which is the diet of the working class.
Sugar
Sugar
was
in your
a
tea,
minor
biscuits.
part. Sugar was half of 1% of national income. Sugar was sugar in your tea, dear.
That's incredibly important for the working class.
No, it
Tea
wasn't
is an
incredibly important
stimulant.
for the.
It's an important stimulant for the.
Well, okay, an important stimulant. So is bread an important stimulant. So is beer an important stimulant, all of which were made at home and were much, much larger than slavery. If the famous Williams hypothesis were true, that it's slavery that made modern capitalism, then any small industry could have made modern capitalism. One suspects that slavery has been tagged this way because it's a bad thing, and people want to find something bad at the origin of capitalism. They want to find exploitation of the workers, they want to find slavery, they want to find bad things. But it's too small to have this effect, and it's certainly too small to explain a factor of 30 in increase in income per person. Pass it around. Why don't you go back there and we'll eventually get around.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciated that.
Good, thank you.
I think the way you tell your story about economic growth,
I have.
which I, in your presentation, perceive to be framed in terms of causalities. So then,
Yeah.
my next question would be, well, why? How did innovation become ethical? Right?
Well, that's right. That's what
And-
volume 3 is about.
Okay. Before I get the chance to buy the book, maybe to follow up on this. I mean, maybe causalities are not the best way to explain this, and it would make sense to say maybe the reason this happened actually had something to do with, like Duncan put it, the social relations of production, and that there was actually some sort of, I don't want to call it necessity, but something that required innovation to become ethical. How would you relate to such an argument?
I think that's to put the cart before the horse, but it's an empirical matter which we can test by looking at other societies, or looking within Europe or England, by looking at the biographies of individual innovators, by in lots of ways. I mean, that's the job in volume 3. And I hope the other volumes that other people are going to write about this argument. I don't think Duncan said the social relations of production. Maybe that's what he meant, but that's not what he said. He didn't use the Marxist phrase. He said, well, there could have been sociological changes that fed into an uprising of innovation. And again, I would test those the same way. I'd say, okay, now let's see. Are there similar conditions in Japan at the time, and I would do the job of a historian or a social scientist.
But there is a cart and a horse in your argument.
Yeah, there is a cart and a
There cannot
horse.
be some sort of mutually reinforcing circular movements that propels.
Well, yes. I mean, for instance, dignity. If innovation had been on the whole unsuccessful, and if ordinary people had not, like our ancestors, I'm sure your ancestors are extraordinary, but mine are ordinary. If my ordinary ancestors had not been enriched by this, then, in line with what you're saying, their dignity would not be as high. And that's a very sensible feedback, which I agree with. Again, you don't want to say, oh, well, that means there's a feedback just because you can think it up. We can't solve great scientific questions on blackboards. We can only solve them by looking at facts. And the facts don't speak for themselves. They've got to be theorized, and we have to have controls, and we have to think it through. But yeah, I agree with you. Next. It'll come around soon.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that, and I'm friendly as to the arguments, having pointed out to students that accumulation did provide pyramids at one point rather than all the change we knew.
It did.
And I understand what the market does, but as someone whose field is sustainable development, I'm thinking that, you know, there's so many things about which we're ignorant, that things that that people choose in the market are at this point
terrible,
in danger of destroying the human habitat.
I agree.
So I was just thinking that we might not be so as advanced as we'd like to think we are.
Well, we aren't as advanced, but of course my view would be, let's bring it up here. If you could just bring it up here, I'd appreciate it. Why don't you bring it up? Someone bring it up. We need to worry about the environment. But one way of protecting it is to price it. How many cows do you think there would be if we suddenly made cows public goods? If no one owned the cows? How many acres of Amazonian forest would survive if the forest weren't owned? Whoops, it's not owned. So it's being cut down at a fantastic rate. So you can go either way. You can either move in the direction of more regulation, which may be the right thing to do in some cases, or you can move, I mean, for example, the ozone hole caused by hairspray hairspray, there's a trade-off that even a Chicago school economist is very willing to say, let's make a law against hairspray with this propellant in it. But on these other matters, sometimes you can do better by extending the market and making it the test. Because if we simply abandon market tests, I mean, if you care, I hope that Obama wins. But I think that his business about wind power and solar energy is to have someone in Washington, as they always say, making a decision that ought to be made by cost and benefit. So that's my worry about that. But as long as the polluters are paying, as long as they're paying for their garbage, then I have no problem with them.
I wanted to ask.
I don't think it's on.
Is it on?
Oh yeah, now it's on. But you have to think of rock music.
All right. Good. There are a couple of earlier cases.
Yeah.
An enormous increase in agricultural productivity in about the 11th, 12th century was due to the introduction of legumes, beans.
Yeah.
Europe became full of beans, and this.
There was a side effect of that. Speaking of air pollution,
it considerably increased life expectancy because it had improved the diet, and it seems to me that this kind of it was a technological innovation, and it did change the pattern of field rotation.
Yeah.
And that took some doing. Now, the second one.
Wait, can I just stop, and then I'll allow you. I won't make you go away. Yeah, but as I say to my colleagues in economic history, who say, oh, we should really be looking at economic growth in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century. And I say to them, well, dears, that's nice, but there wasn't much of it. The big fact is the great fact. The great fact after 1800. So I'm willing to entertain all kinds of hypotheses about ups and downs of 10% or 20 or factor 100% for that matter before the Industrial Revolution. But we're dealing with increases of 1900% or 2900%.
Okay, I was going to raise the...
And that's not beans.
Yeah, the 15th century is a period, the Phelps-Brown-Hopkins data, but leave that. My real interest is why no mention of science, and why no mention of Protestantism.
Okay.
Now, why Protestantism? Not for the Weber reason,
right,
but because it broke the monopoly of the Catholic Church.
That's right.
Over the regulation of everyday life, the regulation of what you could do, the regulation of what was the right way to do, and put it onto the individual conscience. And that means that that opens the door to innovation, and science provides the material for innovation.
Yeah. Well, I'm briefly no, but I think where Protestantism matters, and it connects with what you say, is in church governance. Because suddenly, all over Europe, and not just Northern Europe, because there were Protestants in Spain and Italy and southern France until they were burned. Ordinary people got to govern their churches. And that's a political change of the sort you're talking about that raised the dignity of ordinary people. I think you're perfectly right to be very doubtful of Max Weber's way of doing it, because his way is essentially through accumulation, and it's through psychology, not through sociology or politics. And I don't think that's how to go. I don't think there's a big psychological change from ancient times to modern times. I think there are sociological and political changes. And the other point was what was it? Science. Now, I've got a chapter in the book, it's the second volume, called Not Even Science. And the key point here is that when we think about science, we tend to think about, and I hear the phrase, science and technology. Science and technology. You have to say it fast. Science and technology. Technology, yeah. Separate condenser for the steam engine, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I understand that. Technology is where it's at. But science, until the very late 19th century, and not much, and really until well into the 20th century, doesn't cause modern economic growth. There's a gigantic increase in income per head, which has nothing to do with science. And it's not too surprising when you think what the science was. The great triumph of 17th century science was Newton's laws of motion. Now let's see. What are we going to do with that? We're going to use that to run our machines on the movement of the moon. It was about celestial mechanics. So, science, I'm not against science. I'm not a member of the House Science Committee. I'm not against science. I believe in evolution, blah, blah, blah. But I know it's terrible. I'm probably going to get attacked when I get outside. But outside these precincts where I take it you do believe in evolution. But here's one way to express it. It's kind of a nasty way, so forgive me in advance. Big science needs the claim that science made us rich. The space telescope, the Higgs boson, who cares? I wish they had spent the money on poetry, which is more useful. But then they'll talk about the high frontier and the romance of man's future. I say man's future in outer space, if we can only figure out how to deal with cosmic rays. So I don't think it's science.
I'd like to revisit the idea of the causal relationship you posit between technological innovation and normativity, except my understanding was that the causal chain actually exists in the opposite way that Johan suggested, namely that you actually start as a result of certain sociological and political conditions with the normative values of liberty and dignity.
I agree with you.
And that this spurs certain technological innovation.
That's right, I agree with you.
Right, except I find that at a certain point there's a positivistic turn from this normative initial orientation. And I don't know whether or not this coincides with the turn of that you associated with 1848. And I'd like for you to clarify this by actually maybe talking about your opposition to Weber. Obviously, you oppose him on grounds of his Calvinist doctrine of predestination and how that spurred capital accumulation. Perhaps not. But my thinking was that if you actually think about his theory of the iron cage of modernity, right?
Rationality.
His is an account of bureaucratic organization. But obviously there is a certain parallelism here in the sense that he also thinks that once the very kind of ideological motivations that spurred capitalism becomes detached from it, then we're left with an empty shell. So what's the normative implication of this?
I understand the argument, and it's think about it a little bit. It's a little strange. He's saying that modern capitalists are more rational than earlier ones, right? That's a claim. That calculation and rationality come to govern the capitalists. He wrote that before the First World War. He actually wrote after the First World War, but he died of pneumonia in 1920. But I don't think the history of the 20th century looks very rational. You know what I mean? Here's what I'm saying. The rhetoric of rationality, and I say this in volume 3, doubtless, or express it this way, the prestige of calculation and rationality steadily increases from Shakespeare's time to the present. Planning, calculation, laying down the future. But the actual ability of us to lay down the future is not all that great. So I don't like his way of talking about the growth of rationality. Have I responded to you or not? Well, let's hear it more. Explain it some more.
So my point wasn't that you actually get the microphone.
That's okay. Just say it loud.
I wasn't suggesting that you somehow concur with his theory of modernization as a process of rationalization.
Yeah.
My point was more about what a simple normative implication of your kind of picture might be, in the sense that I think now market-tested innovation has become very positivistic, and I think you also say that
positivistic. Tell me what you mean by
positivistic. In the sense that
positivistic.
it has become divorced from the initial normative anchoring that it had.
Oh, well, in some ways that's true, and that's what the first volume's about. The first volume is about the normative anchoring of market-tested innovation, so we're on the same wavelength there, I think. But there's if I had time, I could go to the passages in Marcel Mauss. That's how the German would be. He said Mauss. I'm not sure how he pronounced it. He was French, not German. And he talks about he talks about this growing rationality, it's the same point about Veblen. Nate, where was Veblen? You're Veblen. That immoral consumption comes to dominate, right? That the purpose of the capitalist machine gets lost. The transcendent gets lost, put it that way. The higher purpose of all this. And I think that's a danger. I don't think it's necessarily going to happen.
I'll just a quick follow-up. I asked this question because you stated initially that one of your main objectives is to talk about the possibility of an ethical capitalism.
Indeed, that's volume 1.
The reason why I use the term positivistic is that once the capitalist system becomes divorced from this normative anchoring, I got the sense that
I agree.
This market innovation becomes a self-justifying norm.
Now, there we really are on the same wavelength. Agency theory, prominent in American business schools in the last 40 years, is a snare and a delusion. It's saying, go ahead, guys and gals, maximize, increase the value of the firm. There's a famous article by Milton Friedman, my friend Milton Friedman. It's 1973, which was in the New York Times Magazine. And here's its title. The purpose of managers should be to maximize the value of the firm. Now, if you know about big-time journalism, you know that titles are supplied by the magazine itself, not by the authors. I wrote a piece in the New Republic in June about measuring happiness. And they came up with this title, Happyism, the creepy new economics of pleasure. Wow. That title of Milton's paper, which has been used as kind of a constitution for agency theory and go ahead, max you, and do Samuelsonian economics in your life and so on, is a misquotation of what he said. Because he said, in the article, he said the purpose of the managers of the firm should be to maximize the value of the firm, comma, subject to the ethical standards and laws of the community. And that's a very different statement, which business schools, to their embarrassment, are starting to do something about. I was amused, this was a long time ago, and Harvard Business School got $25 million to do ethics teaching in the Harvard Business School. And my joke is, all the ethics that money could buy.
Why don't we take two more questions?
Thank you. I have a quick follow-up on the questions of the limitations of the development that you have noticed, and I try to understand the difference between the increased wealth 8,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution and the increased wealth today.
Yeah.
And following your argument, what I heard was that today, or in the last decades or 200 years, the rate of technical change, the productive forces would be the other term for this phenomenon.
Sure.
The
bourgeoisie in the last century has made more productive forces.
Exceeded the rate of population growth, because you said the earlier revolution was kind of turned down by the upcoming Malthusian solution. So what prevents the current situation from going through the same solution?
Well, it could.
How could the slowdown of technological growth be prevented?
Well, it could. We could be in a Malthusian situation. It's conceivable. The late Paul Ehrlich, the recently late Paul Ehrlich, wrote a famous book in 1968 called The Population Bomb, in which he said we would all be starving and rioting in the streets by the 1990s, precisely on Malthusian grounds. But Malthus has been scooped, is how I think of it. Indeed, there's been a hockey stick in population as well as in income per head. And as you know, the population of the world was about a billion in 1800, and now it's about 7 billion, but it's slowing down. In every country that's experienced economic growth, and this is more and more countries, the birth rate has fallen like a stone. It's falling now in India. It fell in China because they shot you if you had a second child, but still, it's falling. So it's very important that we didn't go to the carrying capacity of the modern world, which someone has plausibly calculated as 100 billion people. I'm glad we haven't.
Give the last word to Fernando.
Just a very quick question. You mentioned that you agreed with Gramsci, and I was curious how that could be.
Well, you know, he speaks Italian. I like Italian. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva. No, so does Lenin, for that matter. He says that ideas have an independent effect. He says they're not completely independent. I admit that the bourgeoisie creates an intelligentsia that does its will, but he brought ideas into European Marxism. Is that a fair statement, you think, or just crazy? Good.
Fair or crazy? What'd you say?
No, he says it's.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Deirdre, very much.